Transcribing music is a skill that takes practice. When done well, it can be an art form in its own right. It's also a thrill to be able to play the music that you love on your own instrument. But transcription can be intimidating, especially when the music is complex. I thought I'd share a few tips and tricks I've learned over the years. Before getting started, it's worth doing a quick search to see what's out there. There's no sense in reinventing the wheel. Lots of tracks from older video games have already been transcribed, often for a variety of different instruments and ensembles. Even newer games like Shovel Knight have thriving transcription communities. But let's say you want to transcribe something that's never been transcribed before, or maybe never for your instrument. For retro video game soundtracks, there are basically three resources I turn to for this kind of thing. The first is, of course, the audio. I'll come back to that in a minute. Did you know that for many older video games you can find Midi files? That's right, Midi, a format that's been around since the 1980s and somehow stood the test of time. Midi files can be a quick way to find note-for-note transcriptions of early video game tunes. Simply take the Midi file and open it in a notation program like Sibelius or MuseScore and, well, there are some problems. While there are a decent number of Midi files out there for NES, SNES, and Sega games, you definitely can't find everything. And sometimes what you do find is so wonky as to be practically unusable. To be honest, I rarely use this method. When I've done it for a couple of tunes, I've had to do a massive rewriting of the Midi file, fixing clefs, normalizing rhythms, etc., which almost took as much work as transcribing by ear, although it did at least give me a place to start. Another method for early or retro game soundtracks is, of course, trackers. The online chiptune community is very active, and there's tracker data available for lots of games nowadays. For Shovel Knight, you can find FamiTracker data for pretty much every song. If you're unfamiliar with trackers, they're basically kind of a spreadsheet where you enter pitches, rhythms, and other musical information using letters and hexadecimal notation. Sections of music are called patterns, and they can easily be repeated, looped, or arranged. Unlike standard Western music notation, which reads from left to right, trackers scroll from top to bottom. Early video game composers and geniuses like Jake Kaufman composed directly into a tracker, so what you're seeing is the most accurate version of the notation possible. The downsides of this are you need to know how to read it, and understanding what you're seeing can be daunting. For Shovel Knight, some folks have transcribed these tracker files into Western musical notation, and that's awesome. But here's the other problem. While it's great to have the music in this format, especially for the purpose of analysis, transcriptions like this are not super useful from a playing perspective, since they tend to be way too complex, often representing 8 or more channels worth of information. If you want something playable, and that's probably why you're here, you've got to use a different method. That's right, the tried and true method of transcribing by ear. Yes, it's time-consuming and difficult, but in my opinion, it's usually the best way to achieve a result that makes sense for your instrument. Transcribing by ear takes a lot of patience. How you approach the process is going to depend on your goals, your musical background, and the instrument you're writing for. I'm a keyboard player, so I tend to view transcriptions through that lens. How am I going to arrange this music for 2 hands, or sometimes 4 or 6? What elements are going to work well on the keyboard, and which ones will need to be adapted or even left out? So I'm not trying to say that the way I do it is the only way or the best way to transcribe video game music, but it's the method that works for me that I've developed over years of listening, arranging, and playing video game music on keyboard instruments. I'm going to walk you through my process of transcribing a video game tune. You might have a different process, but this is what works for me, and hopefully there'll be a few tips in here that you can apply to your own efforts. First off, listen for structure. Most early or retro video game songs loop around the 2 or 3 minute mark. While some songs loop back to the beginning, others will skip the introduction or loop back to a later pattern. Once you've gotten the lay of the land, think about where you want to start transcribing. It doesn't need to be the beginning. In fact, I often skip the introduction, if there is one, and start where the main melody comes in. I think our brains are hardwired to hear melody, so if there's something that sounds familiar, why not start there? After you've determined where to begin, it's time to start doing some notation. Unless you're old-fashioned or a monk, you'll want to use a notation program. MuseScore is really powerful, and it has the advantage of being free. However, I've been using Sibelius forever, so I have a workflow and I tend to stick with that. It's also pretty powerful and super reliable. In general, start with either the melody or the bass line. These two elements will provide the backbone for the transcription. Proceed slowly, like one measure at a time, maybe 3 to 4 seconds of music, isolating the melody or bass in your mind and listening carefully for pitches and rhythms. If you're not 100% sure what pitches you're hearing, try singing them back to yourself. Sometimes it's easier to figure it out when it's your own voice you're hearing. Use the notation software's playback feature to test out what you've written and adjust as necessary. There's no real secret to this. Just listen, sing, notate, and repeat until you get it right, or as close to right as possible. One thing that helps tremendously, especially with more complex tracks, is slowing the music down. Here's where YouTube's 50% speed setting is really useful. As you proceed, try to think about melody and bass together. Do they make sense, or do they conflict? A little bit of basic music theory can be your friend here, but even if you don't have a theory background, you can use your ear to judge this. Now that you've got your skeleton, you can start filling in some details. I usually try to transcribe the remaining parts as accurately as I can. But in chiptune music that's conceived symphonically, you're bound to have some problems. Let's look at Jake Kaufman's Crypt Road from Mina the Hollower, which I transcribed recently. In this piece, the register is really spread out in places, and there are certain things that simply won't fit in the hands when transferred to keyboard. I'd say that the number of details you include at this point depends on both the constraints of your instrument and your playing technique. You might find that certain things work for your playing style and ability while others don't. You don't need to include every single counter melody to make an effective transcription. I mean, let's face it, you only have 2 hands, and there are 8 channels of music. And honestly, no one will notice or care. Except that guy. Adapting the music for your instrument involves a lot of back and forth between the score, the audio, and the instrument itself, and there's trial and error involved. A lot of it is about what feels right. Once I feel like it's started to settle in, then I usually try to clean up the score to reflect my intentions. Sometimes in doing this, I realize that certain things were out of whack. In my Crypt Road transcription, I realized that I used a key signature of G minor because of the first chord, but really it should be D minor. You can see that once the melody comes in measure 9. I also started notating this in 4/4, but decided to convert it to 2/4 because as I was playing, it felt like the stress was really on every half bar rather than every bar. I also added in some slurs and articulations. This one I ended up playing on a double manual harpsichord, so there's a nice sense of contrast between the different sections. You can find the complete transcription linked in the description. Final thoughts. If you've never made a transcription before, I recommend starting out with something really short, like a loop that lasts a minute or less. Don't stress about getting it perfect. Accuracy in the melody and bass line are way more important than the inner voices. Do pay special attention to that bass line, since in this kind of music it often provides the rhythmic impulse that drives the music forward. The most important thing is to have fun. Don't worry about measuring up to other people, since everyone's at a different level, but do try to set the bar a little bit higher for yourself every time. Last thing, if you find this kind of video helpful, do let me know in the comments, since I'm not used to making these kind of long form videos. Hope it was useful. Happy music making, happy transcription, happy New Year, happy Christmas. What am I talking about? See you later, guys.